It's about are the UN and international law still relevant? It's a theme that comes up over and over again. So first of all, I want to send you a big welcome. So some of you, maybe it's the first time in Rome, and it's really nice to see all of you. And I also want to thank the Model UN Organizing Committee, done an excellent job, and very proud of you guys. So the theme of marginalized and vulnerable populations is important because basic moral principles mandate, or I would say necessitate, that each of us, when we are able in some way to help others. Sometimes very small actions on the part of one person can do a lot for somebody else. So in terms of basic morality, assisting marginalized and vulnerable individuals and people obviously is a moral principle. But it's also a principle of social justice that society supports individuals and groups who are more vulnerable or marginalized simply because everyone has a right to human dignity. If we accept that principle, then it's not okay that some are more vulnerable than others and marginalized, etc. So that's a basic point. And not only that, but no one is invulnerable from injury, sickness, or death. Therefore, everyone has an interest in social protection, because any of us at any time can be in one of those more vulnerable or disadvantaged or marginalized positions. So from all points of view, the theme is very apposite to what is happening, I think, since time immemorial, but particularly since recent events. So not only that, but much of United Nations activities and international law directly try to address the situation or the plight, predicament of more vulnerable people and marginalized. So particularly over the last few years, very powerful states have been openly violating cardinal rules of international law and marginalizing the UN. So it's, as I say, it's a very current and topical issue, as I'm sure everyone knows. So let me refine the point a little bit. On 15 January 2026, so a few weeks ago, United Nations Secretary General Guterres told the General Assembly, at a time when we need international cooperation the most, we seem to be the least inclined to use it and invest in it. Some seek to put international cooperation on death watch. Those are very clear, I would say, but also accurate words from the Secretary General. And on 23 February 2026, so again a few weeks ago, he observed, and he was at the UN Human Rights Council, that human rights are under a full-scale attack around the world. The rule of law is being outmuscled by the rule of force. The assault is coming not from the shadows. We're kind of used to that, where you have, all sorts of actors at the international level doing things. But it's open, and it's happening in plain sight, as he says, often led by those who are holding the greatest power. So human rights are being pushed back deliberately, strategically, sometimes proudly. Consequences are devastating. And when human rights falls, everything else tumbles. So it's a very critical element of human well-being around the globe. The Secretary General stated that the UN could exhaust its cash reserves by mid-July 2026 because member states owe $1.57 billion in unpaid dues. So by mid-July, the UN may be out of money, which is absolutely an absurd situation, because the budget of the regular budget of the UN, which covers costs in the offices of New York, Geneva, Vienna, and Nairobi, is around 3.56 billion US dollars. It costs, let's say, for the New York City Fire Department, or Tokyo City Fire Department, it's about the same, 2.5 billion. Plus one B-2 bomber, that's, let's say, 1.5 billion. And you have more money with those two things than it costs for all the regular budget of the UN. And it's not including peacekeeping or the agencies. But still, I mean, we're talking not a lot of money when we're talking about the things that the UN does. So we are now forced to reflect upon whether we are drifting towards a world where might makes right, and power is treated as somehow equivalent to justice. It's an old debate that you find in the Plato's Republic between Thrasymachus and Socrates. And, it's an old one, it's not a new debate, but it's becoming sharper right now in international relations. Whether the UN and international law still hold relevance in an era increasingly shaped by Realpolitik and brute force. Whether the UN has outlived its usefulness. Should it be streamlined, fundamentally reformed, or abandoned altogether, maybe as a relic of a bygone era? So these are the choices that are being forced upon, I would say, the world. What kind of world do we want to leave to future generations? And how should global governance be configured in the decades ahead to meet challenges? So these are obviously weighty questions. They're not easy to answer, but maybe we can reflect upon these. To consider these questions, we must recall our most pressing challenges, which you can come up with your own list, but the United Nations and the global community at large consistently considers climate change, environmental degradation, armed conflict, weapons of mass destruction, and now with AI, deepfakes and cyber attacks, extreme wealth concentration, and at the same time, increasing extreme poverty, health crises, and then this cluster of authoritarianism, weakening of democracy, rule of law, and human rights. So these are kind of most pressing challenges before us. Climate change. According to the Secretary General, climate change is the defining threat of our time, and simply because extreme climate events, heat waves, drought, floods, food insecurity, sea level rises, amplifies all the risks of livelihood, health systems, displaced communities, and existing inequalities. So it's something which, across the board, exacerbates all of these vulnerabilities. And it hits the most vulnerable first and hardest. So this is very much, again, concerning for us today. So looking at armed conflict and that those other items. In his new agenda for peace, the UN Secretary General stated that today's conflicts are more complex, more fragmented, and less predictable. And he warns of the heightened risk of nuclear weapons use by accident or design. I don't need to remind you that certain powers have been threatening the use of nuclear weapons in the recent last couple of years. He also stressed that cyber attacks and disinformation and deep fakes are destabilizing societies, and it gets right into eroding trust in public institutions. and in media as well, media institutions. So when you undermine trust, everything that you do in terms of governmental action or intergovernmental action becomes much more difficult because the people you're trying to serve or should be serving don't have the trust in the institutions. Risk of nuclear escalation is at its highest level since the Cold War. I think Secretary General's correct about that. Cyber warfare and information manipulation becoming weapons of disruption. So those are all major problems, but there's a few more we have to canvass here. People are most vulnerable during time of armed conflict. It's something that President Pavoncello was mentioning, and that's a key thing. Let's take a look at the UN Charter for a moment. Use of force rules. So the use or threat of force against any state's territorial integrity or political independence is prohibited. We all know that because you're all studying the UN Charter, right? It's Article 2.4. Self-defense is permitted only if an armed attack occurs. It's Article 51. States exercising self-defense must immediately report their actions to the Security Council. It's again Article 51, it's there. And then you have Articles 39, 41, 42, which oblige the Security Council to determine threats or breaches to international peace and security or an act of aggression and recommend what measures shall be taken, including non-military or military measures. The rules are there in the UN Charter. It's not like the UN Charter in that sense is faulty. There's a lot of authority to use coercive power to maintain or to restore international peace and security. Just to remind you of these very important rules. Yet the permanent five, permanent members, 5 permanent members, they've been killing the effectiveness of the UN and international law, I would say by 1,000 cuts. The Charter authorizes any of the Security Council permanent members, which are these countries, China, France, Russia, UK, or the US, to block any substantive resolutions, even if all the other UN members agree to the draft resolution that's being put forward at the Security Council. All you need is one of those veto-wielding members. So sanctions, peacekeeping missions, collective security action can be halted by a single no. That creates UN paralysis, where the world most needs decisive collective security action and blocks the effective implementation of international law. Instead of using the veto power sparingly, which is what was the original design, each P5 country has cast its veto to protect its own selfish interests and that of their friends from collective security action. Even that, though that, the way I consider it, is outrageously self-interested. And it's a conflict of interest. That's not the way it's supposed to work. You just protect yourself or your friends. Take a look at the UN Security Council vetoes. That's what we have. That record is out there. There's a lot of bad conscience out there, I would say, these P5 members should have. So take a look at it. These are large numbers of vetoes. And they're each on to protect your little own interests. And forget about international peace and security in most cases. It has nothing to do with serving that very important value, principle that we all need. Since taking office on 20 January 2025, the Trump administration has ordered the aerial bombardment of the following countries: Yemen. This is just since January 2025, so it's a year and some weeks. Iraq, Syria, Nigeria, Venezuela, Caribbean Sea, Iran, and all of these examples violate international law, since no country above first launched an armed attack directly against the US. We just saw the UN Charter rules. I wish some of those people who are responsible for this might take a look at their copy of the UN Charter. And it violates United States law, because there's a War Powers Resolution which requires the US Congress to be consulted, which means before military action has been taken, not afterwards. And the Trump White House failed to inform Congress prior to any of these attacks. Russia's record is no better. Even if you just look since 2008, you have Georgia, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, Syria, Central African Republic, Libya, Mozambique, Sahel region, and Ukraine again, with all sorts of military action that's indiscriminate, aimed at civilians, extreme violence, nothing constructive about it. The UN Charter and international law prohibit using threats or armed force in international relations for such excuses as general geostrategic considerations. And I'm giving some examples. For example, Russia says, we're going to stop Ukraine from joining NATO. Okay. It's not a good excuse. Ukraine is a sovereign and independent country. It can do what it likes. It's also a co-founding member of the UN with Russia. Russia and Ukraine were both founding members of the UN. Or this, Donald Trump sphere of influence doctrine that's been called the Dunroe Doctrine, play off the word of Monroe Doctrine. Now, national security and national interests, always subjective, always popular. Everybody likes to use it because it doesn't mean anything really unless you try to fill it in with some concrete details. Counterterrorism, very popular since 9/11. But counterterrorism is not a valid excuse for bombing some other country. Grabbing or threatening to grab or extort foreign territory, as in Crimea or threats against Greenland or in Ukraine. Grabbing foreign natural resources, oil, rare earths, violates state sovereignty. It's not acceptable. There is something called a permanent sovereignty over natural resources. It's a major principle of international law. Countering drug trafficking, which you can do through transnational criminal cooperation. There's a whole office in Vienna called the UN Office of Drugs and Crime to do that and to assist countries to do that, not violating, using your armed forces against random states. Regime change, which just doesn't work, just almost always fails in any case, but this is entirely not legal, nor is it legitimate in my view. Spreading your version of freedom and democracy violates non-intervention. Humanitarian intervention, you say we're saving the people against their own government. If it's outside the UN collective security framework and it's not somehow genuine, it doesn't have very much legal credibility. Let's take a look at the Genocide Convention for a moment, because that's obviously, genocide is a case of extreme marginalization, if you like, and vulnerability, right? In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. you have killing, causing serious bodily mental harm, preventing births, and inflicting destructive conditions of life, forcibly transferring children, basically. Punishable acts are all these ones. You can look it up in the Genocide Convention. This is a very quick summary. So the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group is sometimes, difficult to prove. It's a high threshold. But we see it in Sudan, where UN investigators find plenty of evidence. When you have mass atrocities, you have often a lot of evidence. Statements, policy, command orders from superiors that show they're trying to wipe out a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. So it's not impossible to prove genocide, and we have instances of it. If you look at the situation in the Middle East, Hamas, remember, launched a terrorist attack, killing 1,200 persons and taking some 250 hostages. Completely unacceptable from any moral or legal point of view. Israel first invoked its right to self-defense, which is authorized by the UN Charter, because it was attacked. Hamas targets were extensively targeted, and some of that you could say was, well, it's part of self-defense, part of counterterrorism. But then Israel attacked civilian targets in Gaza and used disproportionate force. So by January 2026, the death toll reached 72,000, more than half of which are women, children, and the elderly. They cannot possibly be considered combatants. That's a gross violation of international humanitarian law. And by the way, the Israeli military has recently, after saying that all these figures which come from the Gaza Health Ministry are fake and not to be trusted, said, you know what? Yeah, it was 70,000. So it's not like they're disputing the numbers anymore. That came out 1 or 2 weeks ago. January 30th, about a month ago. So the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on occupied Palestinian territory found or documented the following humanitarian law violations. Attacks on civilians and civilian objects, killings and serious bodily harm, civilians targeted again. Siege, blockade, and attack on conditions of life. That means denial of water, food, electricity, fuel, obstruction of aid, use of starvation as a method of warfare. Attacks on medical facilities, hospitals, clinics, ambulances, and prohibited attacks on medical units. This is like a very nasty, military assault, right? And conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, has been extensively used. Forced displacement and forcible transfer of population, including mass evacuation orders, and moving people to unsafe centers. The Commission also concluded that if you look in the Genocide Convention, and you only need one of these prohibited acts, like killing or, destruction of the conditions necessary for a life, or you only need one of those. The government of Israel was responsible for 4 of the 5 genocidal acts. So it's a lot. It's very thoroughly implicated. I was going to put up another slide, but I don't bother now. But you can find that also the statements made by commanders and by even the President of Israel and the Prime Minister show very extremist type of ideology that goes to the question of intent. So this is all very disturbing. Other threats, extreme wealth concentration. Consider this for a moment. 3.5 billion people live on less than $7 a day, and 700 million of those have to live on less than $2.15. It's just very, very little. And between 2020 and 2023, a new billionaire was created every 30 hours, to just about one a day almost, while 1 million people were pushed into poverty. The richest 1% hold 50% of the world's wealth. The bottom 50% hold less than 1%. And you have these very rich people who managed to double their fortune between 2020 and 2023. Maybe with all the billions they have, maybe they could shove some over to the UN organization. The crisis would be solved immediately. They have so many billions, it's amazing. The 85 richest people hold the same wealth as the poorest 3.5 billion. They all fit. That's why you have a bus here. You know, you could put people in a single bus, and they have as much. So it's extreme wealth at a time when we have also extreme poverty. We're also worried about weak healthcare systems. COVID-19 wasn't the first pandemic, and we hope it's the last. But governments have been under strain, and policy priorities are not always correct. So you have a lot of challenges in terms of vulnerability, marginalized people, in terms of healthcare and access to healthcare. So this reminds us, I think, and this is what I'm trying to do here, of this very important challenge. So 95% of countries were unprepared for COVID-19, and there's about 1.5 million preventable deaths every year. Preventable because, for little money that's missing in the hospital in terms of proper resources, in terms of infrastructure, etc., lives could be saved. We also have rising authoritarianism, weakening of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, which I think nobody could fail to notice. So in this sense, we've seen global freedoms that have declined for the last 18 years. You can choose your source. Some of these are very, very good sources. More than 4 in 10 people now live in countries becoming more autocratic, so moving away from democracy towards authoritarianism. Attacks on the judiciary and rule of law have intensified. So 60% of countries have experienced declines in checks on government power. And when I mean government, it's always the executive. The legislature is sometimes marginalized itself. Human rights protections have weakened in over 50 countries. And civil society and press freedoms have come under historic pressure. So this rounds out the discussion a bit on the types of threats or challenges that we're facing. So recall that the UN Charter was adopted on 26 June 1945 in response to massive loss of life. Just to remind ourselves of that. Global devastation, where cities across Europe and Asia, mainly, were destroyed. Genocide and atrocities, the Holocaust and other gross and systematic violations, which demonstrated the need to make human rights subject to international legal protection. Wasn't sufficient just to leave human rights to domestic authorities. The failure of the League of Nations to stop aggression in the 1930s, and the risk of another world war. If you look at the timeline, I mean, the first nuclear bomb tests took place, I guess it was called Trinity Los Alamos, right? On 16 July 1945, so a few weeks after the adoption of the UN Charter. So that's why the UN Charter's purposes and principles is to maintain international peace and security and to make sure that there are collective measures taken to protect international peace and security. It's not up to one or two or three powerful countries or some sort of coalition. It has to be done through the collective security framework and to suppress aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to make sure that any litigants to a dispute avail themselves of peaceful settlement of disputes and use international law and the United Nations to do that, not to take things into their own hands. To develop friendly relations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples for the purpose of universal peace. Encouraging respect for human rights and promoting harmony among nations, which is not what we're seeing right now. So, what's the importance of international law? Well, it prevents and regulates war, or at least it's supposed to, protects human rights, promotes peaceful dispute resolution, regulates the global commons, facilitates international cooperation, and addresses global challenges when it's allowed to do that, enforces criminal accountability through the ICC and international criminal tribunals, protects vulnerable populations, stabilizes international relations, because when you have international legal norms, states, governments representing states, know what to expect or what they should expect from other countries, right? So that reduces uncertainty and the risk of war. Sets the boundary in the sense also of legitimate conduct through legally binding rules that define right from wrong, and that rules out might makes right. Might doesn't make right. So all the issues we've been discussing here are international. They're not purely domestic issues. I mean, they're also domestic because the consequences, etc. But they're not purely domestic. They're all international or also transnational. So that's why we have to have, the United Nations, or a similar organization, if you like, an international law to work, because it has been effective in many areas. One of them is in preventing and mediating armed conflict through diplomacy, peacekeeping missions, ceasefire monitoring. I could show you a long list at some point, of effective peacekeeping missions if one or the other power hasn't vetoed something. In the Security Council, humanitarian relief and disaster response, setting global norms, treaties, and standards on human rights, climate action, disarmament, and international law, coordinating global health response, and development and poverty reduction work. So, to strengthen the UN and international law, we need to consider, I think, the following. This Security Council is not working. It's blocked collective security action, which is so important, because when you have war, everything else is ruined. So this 5 vetoes, you have to either dilute the veto power, or broaden it out in some way, and also bring in other countries on the Security Council. There's a difficulty with that we're going to talk about in a moment. Strengthen the ICC, ICJ, and UN Human Rights Council. These are organs there that are promoting, protection and promotion of human rights and well-being, economic, social, cultural rights, etc. Enhance increase sustainable and predictable funding for the UN. enhance transparency and accountability, and empower the UN to address global public goods more effectively. So, what next? It all depends on political will. So, the Security Council requires, if you want to amend the UN Charter, it requires 2/3 of the General Assembly. I think there's a lot of votes you'd get from the General Assembly, but all 5 members need to agree. US, Russia, and China resist changing their veto powers. Actually, the UK and France have said, this isn't working, everybody benefits if we have strong collective security, and they've said they were open to discussing it and giving up their exclusive veto power shared with the other 4 members. But US, Russia, and China have resisted this. Geopolitical rivalries is also an obstacle to UN reform. Member state sovereignty concerns, unequal funding and political dependence, and a fragmented global governance system. And there's subtext here that one can look at. But I think at that point I would just close it off, and that completes my presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Tried to cover obviously a lot of ground in a short time. But thank you very much.